Okay, we got a little change of background because we had to change some setting here. So, sorry, I know it's just up in the little corner, so you don't see a whole lot, but yes, different place now. So, okay, so let's keep going. We had done the first and the second ways, or first and second arguments of Aquinas's for God. Now we're going to talk about the third way, and the third way is different from the first two. I think it's actually pretty interesting, but it's very different because it's not going to talk about those causal chains exactly. So let's talk about this one. This one's called um, sort of an argument from contingency and necessity. And this is actually going to be incredibly important when we get to part 9 of Hume's dialogues, one of the 4 parts that I want you to read, which is the discussion between Philo and Demia. And so that's going to be pretty. This is one you're going to want to come back to think about and take a look at it. But this distinction that Aquinas draws here is between a contingent existence and necessary existence. So let's talk about what those two things mean. Something is contingent if it didn't have to exist. If it just happens to exist, then it's contingent. In other words, if it could have or it might not have existed, that's a contingent existence, a contingent thing. Most everything that we interact with in our lives ever is a contingent thing. Like, did the earth have to be here? Well, no, maybe not. Like, does this mouse have to be here? No, it doesn't have to be here. I could have a different mouse, right? So most of the actual things that we encounter are going to be contingent. The way he talks about it is that a contingent thing could have failed to exist. In other words, it's possible to conceive of it not existing, and things would be fine. It just so happens that it doesn't exist. So, so other things, you're contingent, the university is contingent, the sun is contingent, anything that pretty much you and I come into being with at some point is contingent. The other thing about contingent things that he says is important is that they usually are things that came into existence. In other words, they used to not exist, and at some point they'll probably not exist again. In other words, contingent things come into existence and then they pass away. They die, or they go away, or they disintegrate, or something like that. So not only might they not have existed, but they probably didn't exist at one point and probably won't exist again later. Okay, so that's what all of those things are, what Aquinas thinks a contingent being or contingent existence entails. Something necessarily exists if it, he says, could not have failed to exist. In other words, its non existence would be impossible or self contradictory. In other words, it as the kind of being that has to exist, that there is no way to think of it as not existing. A, a kind of version of that would to be to try to imagine yourself thinking but not existing. It's like, as long as there is thinking, as long as there is feeling, you have to be there. That's kind of Descartes' point, right? There's all, as long as I'm thinking, I am there. That whatever I am, I'm there thinking that thing. That's a kind of a sort of necessary condition. But a contingent thing would be something that you can easily conceive of as not existing. There's a little bit of a similarity here, if you think about it, to Kant and both hypothetical and categorical imperatives about things that can be true under certain situations or can exist under certain situations. Like contingent things and hypothetical things are on the same side. And then categorical and necessary things are on the other side, where there are things that have to be true no matter what, or have to exist no matter what. That's just an analogy for how to think about it. So, okay, so we have those terms, contingent existence and necessary existence. So here's Aquinas' third argument. What he says is that everything that we observe in the ordinary world is contingent. But, Aquinas says, if everything were contingent, in other words, if all that existed were contingent things, then there would have been a time when nothing existed. Okay? In other words, if you go back in time long enough, you would have hit a point where just by the sheer law of averages, nothing would exist. Okay? So if every contingent being comes into existence at a particular point in time and passes away, Well, then there had to be a time either in the past or maybe far in the future, but especially way back in the past, as far back as you can think, when there would have had to have, it turned out, be nothing existing at all. But, he says, um, so I'm getting my logic straight to be sure I explain it to you. Yeah, but he says there's a problem with that because if every possible thing um, is, wait, sorry, I have it written down because I definitely want to make sure I get this right for you guys, and I wrote it down strangely. So I'm going to forget that. I'm going to forget what I wrote down. So instead, think of it this way. If you go back in time far enough, there will be a point where nothing existed. And the problem with that gets back to that problem of causation. That if contingent things are all things that, don't have to exist, if there was a point where nothing existed, there would be no way for anything to start coming to existence, right? Things, he said, don't emerge on their own. They don't just pop into existence randomly of their own. They always have to come from some other thing. So if there was ever a time when nothing existed, then nothing could exist now, he says, if everything is truly contingent. So what that means, therefore, in other words, what he's trying to say is you can't get something from nothing. And if all that exists are contingent things, there had to have been a time when there was nothing but nothing. But that can't be because stuff exists now, right? We're here. Something exists now. So he says there never was a time when absolutely nothing existed. And therefore, not everything is contingent. There has to have always been one thing. There has to have always have been at least one thing. And what he says then is that thing, whatever it is that has to have been there, that's a necessary being. That's something that has to have existed to start making other things come into being. That thing is God. That necessary being is God. So, according to Aquinas, there is one kind of necessary being, one thing that has to exist of necessity, and that's God. And the evidence for it, he says, is just because there are things now, because there are contingent things now. If everything just was contingent, nothing could have ever gotten started, because there would have been a point where nothing existed. So, notice how really different this argument is from the first two, right? The first and second ways are all about causal chains. Like this goes from, from this thing to this thing to this thing. But they're all about what's causing things to sort of move or exist right now. But the third way is actually about the nature of existence itself. So what kind of existence is possible? And what follows from that fact that contingent things exist at all? It's a much more abstract argument, right? It's a little harder to wrap your head around, but it's one that's going to come up again. And Hume and Philo and Demea are going to talk about it in the dialogues. Philo is the person who stands in for Hume. But it's more abstract. It's also, therefore, a little harder to just easily dismiss with a counterexample, because you can't just point to something else and say, well, no, there's this other necessary being, right? Or we can't point to things that aren't contingent beings around us. It's all sort of in the logic of the argument. So it's much more abstract, and it's harder to wrap your head around. Okay. So let's talk about the fourth one then. And by the way, if you do have questions about the third one or feel like you're not so clear on it, you're in good company. That's one of the harder ones of these five, I think. Okay. All right. The fourth way, from degrees of perfection. This is the one that probably sounds strangest to modern ears, but it's actually one that was more familiar back in ancient times and medieval times. This would often be put forward as the first sort of obvious argument for the existence of God. At least according to philosophers. And this one, actually, Plato made a version of this, even, way back in the origins of philosophy. So it's got a long history, and let's take a look at how he talks about it. So what Aquinas says is we just routinely make judgments about things that are more or less good, that are more or less true, more or less noble, more or less beautiful. So we make judgments all the time, like, this thing is better than that. That person is better than that. Or we just got done with morality. This action is better than some other action. We say one person is kinder than another one, right? We say one action is more compassionate or more just than another. One argument is closer to the truth than another. We do that all the time. right? We use these comparative judgments all the time, and we seem to know what we're talking about when we say it. But Aquinas makes an observation, and he says to say that something has more or less of a quality, in other words, more or less goodness, more or less truth, more or less beauty, something like that, implies that there is some standard or maximum against which we're measuring. In other words, he says, if you're going to say that something is more or less good, there has to be something that exists that is perfectly good. Otherwise, how would you ever know how to compare things being more or less? How would you know what that extreme endpoint is of the good side of things? In other words, he says to say something that's hotter or cooler than something else, that makes sense because there's a scale of temperature with extreme heat at one end. Okay, that's kind of the idea here. And he applies that logic to things like goodness, truth, nobility, beauty. And what he says is that if we can say that things are more or less good, there must be something that is maximally or perfectly good, right? A standard of perfect goodness against which everything is measured. Okay, that's the argument. And he does add one little sort of very Aristotelian, Aristotle-like twist here. He says that the maximum of any quality is also, this part is less important, but I want to explain it because it's in the text and tell you what he does. But he says that the maximum of any quality is also the cause of that quality in lesser things. And let me explain what he means by that. His example is fire. And he says fire is the hottest thing, and therefore fire is really the source of heat in everything else. Okay, so by analogy, whatever is most good, the perfectly good being, that's the source of whatever goodness exists in anything else. In other words, the most real or most perfect thing is the cause of whatever that is, that reality or that perfection in everything else. Okay, but that's really not the most important part of this argument for what I want you to understand. Really, the most important part is that he wants to say, as long as we're comparing things, there has to be something that exists on the perfect end of that scale. Okay? In other words, that maximally good, maximally real, maximally perfect being is God, and that would exist, because what is God? People say that God is the perfect being. People say that God is the pure goodness, right? That kind of thing. So he says this, and it's again a more abstract and more logical argument. But it's doing something really different from the other three. It's not arguing from causation or contingency or anything about sort of time at all, but really just from the structure of value itself. You know, he's really just saying, if we can make these judgments, then logically there must be something that exists on the extreme end of those judgments. So the fact that we can even just make meaningful comparative judgments about things, particularly goodness and truth, Aquinas thinks that you have to point, that means that there is a being that's the ultimate ground or the ultimate proof of those things, and that would be God. Again, would be God. So that's another abstract one, right? A little bit more. That one was very common back in the Middle Ages and in the ancient world, because they were fascinated with the idea that if you compare things, you're sort of implying that the things on the end exist. You might be thinking, well, if the perfect good exists, might there also be a perfect evil? Or what about, if hot exists, if the extreme hot thing exists, does that mean that the extreme cold thing exists too? It's a good point. The way they would get out of it is they would say that the lower side is the absence of the thing, not that it's sort of like two different things. So evil, he would say, evil is not a real thing. Evil is the absence of good. So that's how he could get away with not necessarily making an argument for Satan at the same time or something like that. But that's just, again, an aside, just some philosophical fill in the blank there. But that's the fourth argument. And again, the third and the fourth get pretty abstract. All right. So now let's talk about the fifth. The fifth one is the argument from purpose and governance. Okay. The weirdest name, but I think, especially when you think about what we talked about with Aristotle and how all things have an end or a goal that they're reaching for, this one will make some more sense. Okay. And this one, by the way, is the one most directly connected to what Hume's going to discuss in the dialogue. So I'm going to spend a little extra time on it. So Aquinas observes that things in nature behave in regular, purposive ways. Okay? In other words, things follow rules, and most everything has a purpose. An acorn, for example, doesn't randomly become different things on different days, right? It consistently develops toward becoming, say, an oak tree, if it's an oak acorn. Our hearts consistently pump blood. They follow regular rules. Physical laws consistently operate the same way, regardless of where you are in the world. So things in nature, he says, would tend toward specific ends, and they tend toward them reliably, not by accident. Okay? In other words, he's basically saying, like Aristotle did, everything has this kind of purpose. Everything has something it's trying to be, or something that it would be striving for, and everything follows regular laws or regular rules in its life, in its existence. So now here's the philosophical question he asks. How can something tend toward an end if it doesn't know what that end is? Okay, so remember, Aristotle said everything has something that it's kind of trying to become or trying to be. And Aquinas says, okay, well, how could something tend toward that end if it doesn't in some way know what that end is, right? An arrow flies towards its target, but only because an archer aimed it, right? An arrow has no idea where it's going by itself. It has to have somebody who sends it on its way, right? Sends it towards its purpose. An arrow is going to be trying to hit a target, but it has to have somebody do it. Left by it to itself, it wouldn't head toward any target at all. So similarly, Aquinas says, things in nature that consistently act towards specific ends, they can't be directing themselves toward those ends. Because things, regular things, they're not conscious, right? They're not intelligent. So, just like the arrow can't send itself towards its end. There has to be someone or something else directing all those things. And so what he says is, therefore, there must be some intelligent being who directs all things in nature toward their proper end. And that sort of intelligent governor of nature is God. Now notice, this is where Aquinas is very different from sort of modern science. He did not know about DNA, right? He did not know about how there could be things encoded in a biological system in which, a unique organism could grow towards a certain outcome very regularly, kind of by following its own internal rules. He thought that if you weren't a person, you had to have something literally directing you, consciously, as it were. So this one may or may not fit so well to modern ears, but it's one that Hume is going to take seriously. And Hume was on the very early stages, the early beginnings of modern science, and it's one of the reasons why he doesn't like this argument so much. But it's going to come up. But this argument, by the way, is also what Hume's character Cleanthes is going to call the design argument, or the argument from analogy. And it's where the world, he says, looks like it was designed with some purpose. So designed things, he says, has to have a designer. So a similar way to think about this was, imagine that you're out walking in a field and you find a watch on the ground, and you pick up the watch and it's working, and great, you now have a watch. What's something you're going to assume about that watch, probably without even really thinking about it? Are you going to assume that watch just popped into existence right there? Or are you going to say, no, this thing has a purpose, somebody made it? That's kind of the design argument. It's like you look at the world, and the world is too organized to have just popped into existence by itself. It seems too intelligent. It follows regular laws and rules. It must have had a designer. And the designer of the universe, just like the maker of the watch, would be God in that argument. If you've ever heard of a theory called intelligent design theory, that is often sometimes put forward as an alternative to teaching evolution in schools. There was a whole period in the 90s and the early 2000s when intelligent design was all the rage, sort of from the creationist side of things. But it's a version of this argument, basically, that things that seem to have a purpose have to have a designer or a consciousness behind them that's directing them. But this is going to come up again because a lot of people were very swayed by this in Hume's time in particular, and Hume has some questions about it. All right. So anyway, that fifth way is really going to be the bridge between Aquinas and Hume's dialogues. So when you read Cleanthes' argument in part 2 and Philo's objections to it, you're really watching one of the most famous debates about this particular part of Aquinas' book happen, even though he doesn't name Aquinas at all. So early on, think of it how in some ways the arguments work backwards, like they start. The first one you're going to read when you read Hume is this one, is the fifth argument for God, and then you're going to kind of move backwards throughout some of the rest of them. The rest of them, I should say. Rest of thems. That's weird. So, okay, but before we talk about Hume, I just want to kind of step back with, now that we have all 5 of these arguments, and just think about a couple things, because I think there are 2 big questions that you can immediately bring up about a lot of these 5 arguments that are important to think about, and Hume will either bring them up or allude to them in a couple different ways. And so I want to flag these 2 questions. The first one, Aquinas often says that there are chains of causes, of motion, of contingency, that they can't go back to infinity. And he says this with some confidence, but he doesn't prove it, right? He seems to just say that would be absurd. That's his whole argument, was that that would be dumb if it just went back forever. But he doesn't actually try to show that in any rigorous way or not give any reasons for it, at least not in the selections that we read here. He treats it like it's almost self-evident. And the question is it? What is really wrong with a sort of infinite chain of causes, each caused by the one before it? Like I said before, there are versions of modern cosmology, modern physics, which think that, yeah, it really does go back. That you go back to a big bang and then there's a big sort of like drawdown. I forgot what they called it, a big collapse. And then the whole process starts over again. And it kind of the universe just expands and contracts and expands and contracts. It kind of breathes like that. And that's how time is. It just is in a constant loop like that. So there are definitely modern versions that say, no, in fact, that's probably the most likely thing. So that's one thing to think about there. And if the chain has always existed, maybe it doesn't need a beginning, right? So Hume's characters are going to press on exactly that point, and it's worth thinking about it a little bit, and knowing about that in advance will make Hume's dialogues make a little more sense, I think. And the second question you should really ask yourself with these is that even if you actually like all these arguments and you accept every step of them, what have you actually shown? You've shown that there must be something like an unmoved mover or a first cause or a necessary being or a perfect standard or an intelligent governor. But does that being have to be infinite? Does it have to be morally good? Does it have to be one being rather than several beings? Does it have to care about human beings at all? Does it have to be anything like a person, like most religions often think of God? Aquinas concludes each argument with something like, and this is what everyone calls God, right? But the jump from the first cause to the God of traditional religion, there's a lot of work to do in those ways. Aristotle himself thought of an unmoved mover, but his notion of that, he stopped there and said that, yeah, there had to have been a first cause, and that would have been it. But Aristotle didn't think that it was therefore all-knowing and all-powerful and anything like a Christian God might be. So that's another step that I think is worth asking about this, and Hume's going to notice that as well. And he's going to say, well, okay, what if, even if I grant that there is a first cause to things, and maybe that is a necessary being, why does it have to look anything like what people say is God? Why couldn't it just be some physical principle or some logical principle or something like that? Why would it have to be God with a capital G? Now, all of these, I think, are not reasons by themselves to dismiss the arguments, but they're questions to keep in mind and questions to really push towards these arguments. And they're things that, like I said, Hume's really going to be thinking about them a lot. Okay. So next, in the Hume video, after hopefully you've watched this before reading Hume, we're going to turn to Hume's dialogues, where three characters have a really long, sort of searching conversation about these arguments exactly. And you'll see the design argument taken apart from an epistemological perspective, like we looked at last week with Hume's inquiry. You'll see the cosmological argument, which is essentially Aquinas' second and third ways combined, demolished by the characters Cleanthes and Philo for different reasons. And you'll see Philo, the great skeptic who kind of stands in for Hume, reach a very surprising and carefully hedged conclusion at the end. You may find out that the guy who stands in for Hume isn't like a total atheist, maybe, like you might have assumed. So, but as you move from Aquinas to Hume, key thing to carry with you is this. Aquinas is working from the assumption that causation is a real necessary feature of the world. Okay, he's got that difference from Hume right off the bat, as I think you can see from the very beginning of this. So things really do produce their effects, and chains of causes have a real structure that demands a ground. And Hume spent the inquiry arguing that necessary causation is something that's just in our minds, right? That our minds project onto experience rather than something that we actually read off from nature. So once you take that question about causation seriously, a lot of these arguments are going to look different. And what may have immediately seemed in some ways kind of compelling and like, oh, like I know I felt when I first read Aquinas' arguments and really understood them, I was like, oh, that seems right. But the more you think about Hume's questions about causations, it's a question. Okay. And again, like I said, I'm not telling you which one is right or wrong. I don't have an opinion really on which one is right or wrong. But what I do want you to do is see the reasons why each side believes what it does and argues for the positions that it does. Okay. So the dialogues are going to show you a different account for all of these five arguments. And that's what we're going to talk about next.